when I have conversations with artists who maybe aren't playing at the level of a Maria Gaspar or what have you, and they say, do you think it's really important to get an MFA? And I said, it doesn't have to be the thing that makes you a more capable technician. But it allows you to think about your work and talk about your work in a way that's very different than people who don't have that formal education about art and their own practice. And that's got to be the same with a lot of musicians. Like, certainly, I don't think you're going to have like a super intellectual talk with, Dimebag Darrell from Pantera, rest in peace. But you talk to Jewel, and then, she talks about her craft, her music, her vision for everything, very much in that way that somebody with advanced education would speak about their work. But then you just, you see those interviews with artists, and they're like, what was your thinking about this or that? And they're like, I don't know, man. I just like to play the music.
Right. That's my the Tom Petty example. Like, every interview I've ever seen is like, wow, like there's nothing there, right? Like, someone just like sticks a guitar in his hand and it's like, that's it. Like, there's a different genius there, obviously, but like, let me tell you, there is nothing profound coming out of that dude's mouth in any conversation whatsoever.
Hello, and welcome back to the MO Podcast, where we interview changemakers in the art and cultural sector who are building big and ambitious projects. I am your host, Joey Flores, here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal, and back in the studio, we have Rocket Caleshu. Rocket is a writer, film producer, and all-around amazing human being. If you want more about Rocket's bio, go back to our inaugural episode where we have a much longer explanation of Rocket's background and catch up on all the episodes. Today, we're going to do what we do every fourth episode, which is a roundtable recap of the 3 recent releases. We were privileged to interview Jewel, famed musician and now visual artist, with an impressive exhibition down at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. Next, we interviewed my old co-founder, Yotam Rosenbaum, who I built Earbits with for several years, went through Y Combinator with, and then sold Earbits in 2015. And keeping with the music theme, our third interview was with Jeff Ponchick, who launched a company called Repost Network, which he sold to SoundCloud and became SoundCloud for Artists, as well as his new startup, Mogul, which is helping artists recover lost revenues and understand more about their income and business. So, Rocket, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, welcome back. So we were just talking briefly before we hit record. Music is a little bit different than the things that we normally cover. So, definitely some new ideas and concepts there. What were some of your thoughts, Rocket?
Well, I am totally unfamiliar with the workings of the music industry, but my initial observation was like a lot of the tools that it seems like are being developed for musicians seem like they could be highly applicable for artists as well. And I was kind of like, I was laughing a little bit. We were just talking about, kind of the nitty gritty stuff that Jeff was getting into on licensing and, the fact hopefully you've listened to this episode, Jeff's episode, if you're listening to the roundtable, but, he discusses where unclaimed money goes and how it goes back to like the big labels, and what a deep bummer that felt like to hear. And I don't think that there's like an exact corollary in the art world, but just this idea of like trying to level the accounting playing field feels super relevant. And just thinking about how as there are increasing like avenues through which work is seen, and as so many of these amazing startups across industries are developing these tools, the question of where the revenue is coming from seems like even more relevant than ever. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of laughing, like, he's obviously like really amazing at what he does and really into it. And I was like, oh my God, you're the perfect collections guy. Like, everybody needs a collections guy. And I think it is also similar that, artists have to do their own follow-up and chasing all the time. And, advocating for yourself is a necessity regardless. And I like that they had this threshold where if you, brought in, whatever certain amount a year, you probably already have a business manager who's like doing that kind of work for you. But how many people who, even if they're not emerging career, who are mid-career or established, are not necessarily hitting those numbers and don't have people on the business side for them. And sort of the value of the business tools does feel, it feels like there's exciting movement in what we were hearing from the music folks, that I wonder how it could be universally applicable, and how Jeff was talking about, I'd like to make these tools available to any creative people who want them. It's just that within music, I know that business, and there is already the model that enables us to think to follow the money in a different way.
Yeah, completely. I'm curious if you guys think, so he kind of said, the $500,000 a year mark is when you probably have a manager and things like that. I think these services and the need to understand where money comes from, is maybe a little less applicable for an artist that, works specifically in galleries and sells one-of-one works. They don't have so many revenue streams. But if you think about visual artists who are selling, prints and reproductions on fineartamerica.com or any of these other platforms, or maybe they have subscriptions through Patreon or any of these things, like, tracking all of that and keeping an eye on that could be more relevant. But it feels like in the visual art world, you might end up with support a little earlier than $500,000 a year in income, right? Like I think, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think that it's a similar threshold when you start to be able to find someone who will represent you, or do you think that comes earlier for visual artists? What do you think is the income threshold before, like in visual art, people are willing or able to support your career from either a management perspective or even if it's only part-time?
I want to answer that question, but just first, considering that we may have listeners who haven't listened to the Ponchick episode yet, what we are talking about is Mogul, his newest company, which provides essentially a service to recording artists to collect on royalties from various different licenses and streaming platforms and other entities that may be playing a musician's music and collecting royalties on those artists' behalf, or essentially recording and accounting for those royalties on an artist's behalf. But it is up to the artist to go out and claim those royalties and to get them transferred to their own accounts. And by Jeff's own admission for their services, they are on average increasing an artist's revenue through these collections by about 10%, which is, no small amount of money for a recording artist who's involved in those types of things. And this involves both technology, as well as, it sounds like, quite a lot of kind of legal and administrative legwork on the part of the company to track down those royalties on behalf of the artists, and to create, I think what was interesting from Jeff's standpoint is this always on audit of a artist's royalty stream, so that one can go into the various different accounts that a recording artist needs to have with these licensing companies, with these royalty administrators, and get what they are owed. Joey, to the question about the threshold for management help, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I thought that, $500,000 a year in revenues seemed high, I guess. And I'm also thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, how many recording artists are out there like earning $500K a year from their work? We know that from firsthand experience that there are a lot of very well-known visual artists who are on the covers of magazines and in museums and have positions at universities or in multiple galleries showing their work, who still might not reach that threshold. That's pretty high.
I'm guessing like 2% of musicians make $500,000 a year or more.
Yeah. It's a small number. But I agree. At the same time, the dynamics of the two markets seem very different, right? Because with music and the way that the royalty system works, you are the product, for lack of a better way of describing this, except for the fact that this is the world that they're living in when we're talking about the business side of this. The product is this like infinitely reproducible and distributable entity, right? Usually small in scale, both in terms of time and in terms of impact, in the kind of digital distribution landscape. Whereas, Joey, as you said, like, for visual artists, that's just like just a very rare thing that they're involved in, right? Like most of the, even if you think about an artist whose work is primarily prints or photography, well, like in principle can be a, infinitely distributable thing. There's a lot of physical material stuff that goes along with that, and it's a much more friction-full network. And so the idea of that kind of management for collecting on either royalties or even just collecting on payments is a whole different, seems like it's a whole different entity.
Yeah, I think it would be more relevant to, again, like artists who are, on 10 different platforms selling prints for $50, $60, $100 or whatever, right? And like,
Yeah.
they're collecting from all these different places.
But even there, one assumes that, the relationships that they have with those platforms, like the way that it works is that, if something sells up those platforms, they're cutting you a check, right? Like you're getting
Right.
at the end of the month, like something is showing up in your bank account, which is, I think, different. The royalty streaming thing obviously has to have a different layer in it because somewhere along the way, it's not efficient for artists to be getting, 3-cent payments. Whenever a transaction goes through, or even collecting them at the end of the month or something like that. And so that, which presumably is why you have these these licensing and agencies and these royalty administrators that sort of collect all that stuff. But Rocket, like you, I was the one who sort of asked that question. I was like, what, where is this money kind of like coming from? Who benefits or who's not benefiting from let's say the more efficient, comprehensive collection of this stuff. And the idea that these agencies just are like, well, we've got this stuff, probably belongs to the big labels. Let's just cut them a big check. And we're just like, what? Like that doesn't seem in any way fair.
It's so brutal. It's totally brutal. It's just like, oh yeah, sorry, no way.
We're like 80% of that is like, as they know, is indie artists, right? Like, because the major labels have all the infrastructure to collect those royalties on behalf of their big people. So it's like, it's the only equivalent in my head that I can go to is like, it's Ed Ruscha's studio that has the infrastructure and the personnel to chase down all of the resale royalties that Ed Ruscha is owed from sales of his work because he is a California-based artist. And California has a droit de suite regulation on the books, which means that percentages of resales go to California artists when they are sold in the secondary market. That goes for, not just things that are sold in California, but for things that are sold nationally and presumably internationally owed to those artists here. But if you're just a solo operator, that's a full-time job. If you've got any kind of secondary market, and so it's only Ed is got his team of people who are calling people up and being like, hey, fork it over, right? Versus anybody else being able to do that. And I'm sure that it adds to his bottom line. I'm sure that, you have the personnel, it must pay for itself, right? Like if you were employing 3 people full time to chase down your royalties and their salaries combined were like $175,000 or $200,000 plus benefits, and you're only bringing in like $75,000 in royalty, income from that effort, what's the point, right? Like it doesn't pay off at that point to try and make that effort. So someone's making that cost benefit calculation in terms of how much time and energy is it really worth it. But it still doesn't seem fair that those royalties are sitting out there and then just get paid to somebody else, right?
Totally.
One of the things that makes the need for Jeff's service so much more important and makes the music royalties so much more complicated is the collaboration between numerous artists on one recording. So, I may upload my album to 8 different streaming platforms, and I might explain that, Yotam and I wrote the music, but there was 9 other performers, and I might, put all their names in on every song like I'm supposed to, but I don't have their addresses. And I don't have, all of the information that's necessary for them to receive a royalty check. And so what happens is, you upload, and maybe Spotify knows the names of the people who performed on an album. They know who wrote it. So they know that, okay, the publishing royalties are going to these 2 people, the performance royalties are going to these 10 people. But I don't know how to pay these people. I don't know where they are. I don't know their addresses. I just have their names. And so then, what happens is the artists will register with ASCAP or BMI. And, so for publishing, they will, Spotify will pay ASCAP and say, this is for Yotam Rosenbaum and Joey Flores. And theoretically, all you have to do is maintain your contact information with ASCAP in order to get your publishing payments. But the performance royalties that Spotify also plays, and that other companies like Pandora and whatnot have to pay, it would be a lot harder to track down if you didn't have the addresses. There's not necessarily the same kind of organization for paying out royalties like that. So I think that's why a lot of it can get lost, and why it's more complicated is because, in the visual art world, there's not this there's not usually like 5 rights owners for
that's right.
work. Right.
Well, and it's also interesting because that goes to the kind of the structure of the way that the work gets made. I'm thinking about recently, Josh Klein had his big show at the Whitney last year. And one of the things that was notable is on the wall texts, where normally what one is accustomed to seeing is just the artist's name, because Klein's work is so heavily fabricated on these large scale sculptures and installations. They include sound and video and all this other kind of material. Klein has listed a lot of those collaborators on those wall texts to provide credit. But behind that, there's the question of, okay, what is the contractual relationship in the production of this work? How does it look, right? Like, those people are being given credit, but likely the contracts are, these are works for hire. You're getting paid for your time and your expertise. And so the studio and Klein retains the kind of ownership interest, or presumably Klein, in combination with the gallery, anybody else who's putting up some of the money for fabrication, retains some sort of ownership interest in that work. And that is then recovered in the sale of it, either to the museum or to a private collector. And it goes to the people who have those, essentially the ownership stakes. So it's nice that those extra people are getting credit, but I wonder if we can see down the road collaborators within the visual arts space trading immediate income for, essentially a back-end equity stake in the work, which, kind of like in the movie industry, getting points on the, the merchandising or whatever else later on, would entail some confidence that the work that you're doing for this artist has the potential for secondary, tertiary sales and increasing in value, which may ultimately become, would be of greater value to the collaborators than the immediate near-term money is for, the work that they are hired to do. Joey, in the music industry, how does that look? What does that look like? I mean, I assume that, people get paid to play on a recording. They get paid to, be studio musicians. They get paid to perform, but you also get a royalty, right? Like, you also get a cut of the back end.
Yeah, usually you're paying them to not have a claim to the intellectual property, but
Right.
You're not paying them to no longer receive a royalty. So we did, all of our musicians on our album were work for hire, and we paid them for the recording session. They don't own any claim to the music. We can do whatever we want with the music. We can put it on any platform we want and so on, but they're not waiving their royalties. They're still, they still get a performance royalty for every time that the song is played.
Super interesting. Like, so that you can have that cut up like that.
Maybe you can buy them out of that as well and just like not list them as a performer. I'm not sure. Maybe the big labels would do something like that, but certainly it's not, I don't think the standard, and I'm not sure you can really get somebody to forfeit their performance royalties. That's so interesting with, like, I was just gonna say, to your comment about the visual artists, maybe having a stake in the work longer term and foregoing it and having a bit more like this sort of music model. The issue is, at least in the music space, there are these entities that that make sure people are paying what they owe in terms of royalties. They know who to distribute them and so on and so forth. If I was, just a collaborator on some paintings, in an artist's studio. And there was 3 or 4 collaborators, and and then I thought, oh, I'd love to just have a stake of these long term. I got to be tracking when those things sell again. And I got to, there's no accountability except what I'm capable of doing for myself. And, and it's only enforceable to the point that I can afford to enforce it. Whereas in the music space, there are, I don't know if you know this, but let's say you own a bar and you play music over the speakers. You have to have a license with ASCAP, with BMI, with the different recording organizations, and you have to pay royalties. And they will go to any kind of business that plays any kind of music. In fact, I've seen you sometimes you'll go into a bar, and I've even seen signs up by the stage that say no covers. Like you can only play original music because they don't have a license with ASCAP or BMI. So you can play your own songs, which you're entitled to do, but you cannot cover a track by a famous artist because we're not paying the publishing rights that are needed for you to be able to do that. So I don't know if you've ever seen a no covers sign at a live music venue, but yeah.
What I think is interesting is this kind of comparison between the visual arts and the music industry. I don't know any artist to give up their intellectual property rights, right, to their work. That's the big no-no in the visual art world, right? It's even in commissions and licensing and stuff like that, it's you will license an image to somebody, but you are not waiving a whole bunch of the intellectual property rights that go along with that image. Whereas it sounds like, just from the brief description, Joey, within the music industry, it's no, there's a lot more sort of IP waiving that goes on in music, whereas it's the royalty stream that is untouchable, right? That's the thing that maybe not untouchable, but that might be the thing where it's oh, but wait a second, that's not the thing that I'm going to so willingly give up here.
Right, but there's there's also if you're working with a big label or even a mid label, or you sign a bad deal with a label,
right,
depending on the situation, they will own your masters, right? They
right,
own the recording, and so you may be entitled to your publishing rights, you may be entitled to these things. But we had a lot of with Earbits, we had a lot of bands where we would say, hey, would you like to be on the platform? And they would say, I mean, it sounds amazing, but my label would have to approve that because I don't even own the right to put my music on your platform. They
right,
have to be the ones
right,
to do that.
Right.
What was crazy, and Yotam and I didn't talk about this on the episode, but one of the things that happened quite a lot, which it just blew my mind, was we would get artists who really wanted to be on the platform, and they had heard good things about it, and we were talking to them about kind of the results we were generating. They're like, that sounds amazing. And we would then contact the label and say, hey, this band of yours really wants to be on the platform. We're wondering, can we get their album and whatever? And the label would be like, you guys don't pay any royalties, we're not licensing the music to you. And we're like, yeah, we don't pay any royalties, but we, it's really, really helpful in generating email, addresses for the band, Facebook followers, Twitter followers. We know there's a direct correlation to, ticket sales for live shows. And I had numerous labels say, yeah, but we don't make any money from merchandise or shows. So no.
Not worth it.
And I'm like, yeah, but what's good for the band and their show, if it's getting more people to the shows, if it's getting people to buy t-shirts, which are basically walking advertisements for the band, these things are all good in the long term for the band's career. And you'd be surprised how many labels were like, if you're not paying me, you're not using the music. And I don't care if it's good for the band. I literally had people be like, I don't care if it's good for the band. I was like, wow. Lord, I hope if I ever, had a label that they would not talk
hold
about
on,
me that way.
Can I press record just and have you say that again?
Exactly. Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
That's brutal. But I mean, I think it's kind of a piece with this question about intellectual property, which artists are kind of told that that's all they have in a way, is the right to their creativity, which, in owning their production. But I was listening to this talk the other day, and this novelist was talking about some organizing, not entirely just organizing. She'd been involved with other writers. It wasn't specifically unionizing, but she did raise this cool point that I was really obsessed with, which is telling writers that they own the means of production because the means of production is creativity. And so that makes actually you can't take someone's that somehow writing or making art or even making music is somehow like incredibly unique because of the creative aspect, which like lives only in your head and in your imagination. And so you have to like have all this time like alone and to do your creative process, and that's what like is going to that it alienates people from the idea of being workers, which is like essentially a way that people are alienated who work in creative industries from feeling as though they can, organize with other people who do the same thing that they do for additional rights. So this question of like, well, the big label just gets how much was it? Three-quarters of a like how much the labels take back a year in unclaimed royalties. It was like such a huge number.
$750 million.
$750 million. And it's like they're if musicians were organized in a particular way, they could advocate for that money, right? But because of the way, and similarly, I think to this idea, which I've long sort of been thinking around, is like how to credit the people who work as artistic works are increasingly have a lot of hands on them, as things become more multimedia, more intermedia, like as the world of what constitutes an artwork has just expanded a lot, particularly if you think about video works and works that just have a lot of hands on them. This question of how to rightly, include all those people in the chain is a huge question, because if you're working from the perspective that it's your idea, you own it, which is of course objectively true, but then you can't account all the way down the line for how everyone's necessarily contributed in a way that feels fair to all of those people. So most of those people are just gonna be like, yeah, of course I'll take the check up front because I fabricate X, I am video editor Y, that's what I'm gonna do. But it's like not very organized labor. And so it does seem like the more that it's kept disorganized, the less people feel inclined to be able to advocate for themselves as workers, which of course we all are. All artists and writers and musicians are workers. And so it's like it's sort of like a funny fantasy that we keep going, that thus easily enables $750 million to just like go right back to the, pockets from which it came.
Yeah. Although I think that there's a distinction that is worth making. The $750 million that goes back to the recording, the big labels, was not a function of like, that wasn't a zero-sum game of, if the artists are better organized to advocate for a higher percentage of some set of fees that they would receive that. This was, and I think this is the kind of brilliance behind the kind of the entrepreneurial activity that always exists, sometimes at the center, sometimes at the margin of various different industries. It's like Jeff was in a particular place to recognize basically an inefficiency, right? And an inefficiency that had to do with the legacy way that royalties are collected and where that money was. And the fact is like the royalties are there, the money was being collected, it's sitting in, a bunch of different places and a bunch of different accounts, not through any intentional construction on the part of the larger of big music, but kind of an artifact of history of how these things have developed over time. And like many large scale industries, you get these Rube Goldberg contractions of the way things work, and ultimately the hope is that either someone can tear the whole thing down, and it's not what you had built if you were going to start afresh, right? And so Mogul and Jeff's thing is this recognition that, we have to provide an efficient solution for the artists to get access to what is already theirs, and is providing that. And it's more just like the kind of the laziness or the lack of the proper incentives for the agencies and the big royalty collections companies to do the work of what they need to be doing and the way that the regulations are written, right? Joey, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically like they are required to hold that money for X amount of time. They don't want to, after that amount of time, be holding it on their balance sheets. And the things that they are licensed to do at that point is they have to give it to somebody, right? Now, someone could have come along and presumably like started a big foundation, right? That stuff all goes into some sort of nonprofit entity. That nonprofit entity then employs people out of that funds to then try and like figure out who the stuff belongs to and distribute it. Who knows, right? Or they're just like, we're not going to do that. We don't have the incentive to it. We're just going to like give this money all over to the big labels because chances are that we are getting the money back to the people to whom it is owed in the large part, and we are not holding on to it ourselves. Mogul comes along and says, that's not quite right either. We have a solution, combination of technology and people and expertise that can actually distribute this stuff to who it's actually owed to more efficiently. And it's not for want of advocacy and organization. It's more like for want of, efficiency and and energy. But Rocket, I do get what you were driving at, which is also the kind of curious place that artists occupy, because it's like from that perspective, art making is not alienated labor, right? Like it is work,
Yeah.
but it is not in the sort of vulgar Marxist economic sensibility alienated, right?
No.
Because
Yeah.
it does own its own means of production in a sense. It doesn't mean that it's not work and low paid work, and which is one of the big arguments against all the kind of organizing of kind of like arts workers and unionization for creative activities and things like that. It's one of the biggest arguments against like unionizing graduate students, because there's one sense that graduate students are not employees. There's work that graduate students do, which is a part of the sort of learning process. Again, I think at one end of that spectrum, it's exploitative. At the other end, it's not. But it's a little bit different to consider what's happening with the kind of, again, $750 million is like a serious chunk of change. I think was just like, no one was doing something with.
Totally. And then I guess it isn't like, yes, the arcane model that persists and, noticing that inefficiency. And then the question also, I think that a lot of us as consumers of music and how much that's changed in the past 20 years wonder is like, how has stream sharing changed royalties, which is not something that I know anything about. So maybe Joey, you can help me. But I, just in terms of like, as consumers and as our listening habits have changed 100%, what actually does that mean as a consumer of music?
Well, this is interesting because Jonathan shared this article a little while back about this guy who gamed Spotify, right? And he
I was just looking that up, Joey. I was like, I gotta bring this in.
So it's interesting. So he did this by creating a bunch of AI music tracks and uploading them to Spotify. And then he created a bunch of fake Spotify accounts, actual subscribers. And the way that it works is however many, the Spotify takes this pool of royalties, which is whatever a percentage of the revenues they have. They distribute that out basically pro rata against how many times your song was played. And so he set these things up, these fake accounts of his, listening accounts, to listen to his songs 24 hours a day, over and over and over and over again, drive those numbers up very high, and ultimately took, I think, what was it, $1.2 million or 1.8, Jonathan?
Yeah. Serious money.
And royalties. I think like if you don't know how it works, you're like, he stuck it to the man. He stuck it to Spotify. Maybe he deserves that money, but he didn't, because it is a zero-sum game. They are only going to pay out this much in royalties. It's going to get split based on whose songs got listened to. And so the fact that he distorted how much his music got listened to took royalties away from other artists who got fewer plays, right? Like he didn't really like screw Spotify. He screwed a bunch of artists who would have gotten that money.
Presumably, right?
No. I mean, that is exactly how it works. I mean, like they have X dollars to allocate. They split them up by how many songs you have. He totally warped how many listens he was getting. So a bunch of his money got diverted there instead of the other artists in the pool, right? Like it wasn't like, it came out of Spotify's, like it didn't come out of their share.
Their reserves.
They get their standard 30% or whatever. The other thing that, just a little tidbit of knowledge for everybody, but when Spotify was getting off the ground, getting licenses for streaming from the big labels was really challenging because they basically, were still hoping that album sales would continue on. They really didn't like streaming as a model, and so on and so forth. And at the time, especially because it was much more ad supported, the subscriber base hadn't grown enough, and that was really where the money was going to come from. But so what the record labels did with Spotify and probably many others, streaming companies, is they licensed the catalog to them, but and in exchange they received a big equity stake in Spotify. So the major labels had a huge equity stake in the company, which was tremendous value for them, right? Because the company's now worth billions of dollars. That is a return that they don't have to share with the artists. And so they, what ends up happening was two things. They got these huge equity stakes in the company that they didn't have to share with the artists, even though the only reason they're getting that equity stake is because they're giving them all the rights to play this music. And then they also would give them a sweetheart deal on how much royalties they had to pay, but they would charge them like really big catalog fees or data transfer fees to give them the music or whatever. They would charge them fees for this exchange of the catalog that didn't qualify as royalties, which meant that they didn't have to share it with the artists. So they would basically find ways to charge Spotify all kinds of money to give them the catalog of music, but under structures that they didn't have to share. And then they set the royalty rate, lower than it really ought to be. And that's why the artists make practically nothing. And meanwhile, Spotify is getting all that. So, not Spotify, but the labels. So it's kind of crazy if you think about it. You have these labels that have been struggling for the past couple of decades or whatever, ever since Napster came out, that these labels are like suffering. Meanwhile, they're getting a totally disproportionate amount of the revenue from streaming, that more than they should be, because they have crafted the contracts in such a way as to, take money away from the artists and give it to them. On top of that, they've got $750 million that is unclaimed royalties that, it's not defensible at all to say this probably should go to the major labels, because again, that probably all of their artists are properly registered with all of these services, and the labels are properly collecting what they're supposed to be collecting. And it is supposed to go to these independent artists who are less organized, less registered with the organizations and stuff like that. So you have all these major labels like still struggling to survive, and yet they're the beneficiaries of these like massive exchanges of value that they really don't deserve, which is just kind of crazy. Let's talk about the Jewel episode. I mean, that was an exciting interview. I mean, first off, certainly when I originally found out that Jewel had this visual art exhibition, that was a surprise. And then, absolutely love her oil painting, but the drone show is obviously like the big deal there. So yeah, Rocket, what did you think of that?
Well, first of all, love Jewel. I thought she was I felt the thing that she talks about, the experience. I mean, she just like has created such a high touch experience, like just hats off to her, because I think she just has like created a exhibition that it seems like people are super amped on, and that's cool. And also just like has so many touch points, which, she's obviously thinking. But my initial reaction was like, the way she kind of talks about her creative output, like the effect that she hopes it has on people. I like felt that from listening to her talk. You know what I mean? She was like, I want people to feel open. I want people to feel like they're having a better day. I want people to whatever. And I was like, I just feel like that, like listening to you talk. I thought she was like kind of there. Obviously she has like that X factor, and it's clear. But also just the way that she's thinking about creative work. There's something about it that's so not rarefied, that I mean that as a huge compliment, and I felt like it kind of just comes through on all levels from her. The way she's like interested in working, she's really formulated through trial and error over a long period of time, and so hats off to y'all for talking to her.
Yeah, I just, again, like I always am extra impressed by artists who can do such a wide variety of things, like her, Enrique. I just, to just be multidisciplinary, but at a level that's where all of your disciplines can be appreciated, is just, to me, just special. So that was very cool.
Yeah. Also, she's a very good advocate and articulator of her own aesthetic projects and goals, which I find refreshing. And I kept thinking to myself whether that was a skill that was trained by having to be a advocate and an articulator of one's goals within the music industry during a period of time when she was, highly overexposed, very well known, very successful, with as you can imagine, with like a lot of competing interests coming into the frame for her. And um and so, I give her a lot of credit for both achieving what she'd achieved, but also maintaining this sense of strategy and of orientation that allowed her to, one, do what she wanted to do, but also to move in these new directions each time against the prevailing advice one can only assume of, if you do that, you're going to blow up your career. If you do that, no one's going to listen to it. If you do that, it's going to be something else, and saying, okay, well, hold on a second, right? Like, who am I beholden to? Who am I accountable to? What are my goals here? What do I really want to do? And that really comes across in the work and the projects that she's doing within the visual art space. She's extremely considered about what she's up to. And particularly with regard to the drone show, and this has come out in other conversations that I've had with her, but the idea of not letting this just be something that is sort of owned by a very specific or like single artist activity, right? Like, or like that, like drones become just something that like one artist becomes known for. That's, for example, Studio Drift becomes the place that's like, oh, if you want to do drones, it's Studio Drift. Otherwise, it's just whoever's, gun for hire at your high school, college, or NFL football game for, halftime drone shows. So that is both ambitious. It's an interesting sort of competitive landscape to think about, as well as a kind of aesthetic landscape to think about. And I think she's really intelligent about it. And I was impressed by her, the way that she's going after that space.
Yeah, one of the things that, when you and I started working together and talking so much about the art world and meeting different artists and things like that. And then when I have conversations with artists who maybe aren't playing at the level of a Maria Gaspar or what have you, and they say, hey, like, what, do you think it's really important to get an MFA? Why does the art world value that so much, and things like that? And I said, I don't think it's like that getting your MFA necessarily, it doesn't have to be the thing that makes you a more capable technician. But it allows you to think about your work and talk about your work in a way that's very different than people who don't have that formal education about art and their own practice. And that's got to be the same with a lot of musicians, right? Like, certainly, I don't think you're going to have like a super intellectual talk with, Dimebag Darrell from Pantera, rest in peace. But you talk to Jewel, and then, she just, she talks about her craft, her music, her vision for everything, very much in that way that somebody with, with advanced education would speak about their work. And so, and I think there's a lot of artists that are like that. I think, my favorite band, usually when you listen to interviews by them, it's very heady discussions about sort of how they approach the music and stuff like that. But then you just, you see those interviews with artists, and they're like, what was your thinking about this or that? And they're like, I don't know, man. I just like to play the music.
Right. That's my the Tom Petty example. Like, every interview I've ever seen is like, wow, like there's nothing there, right? Like, someone just like sticks a guitar in his hand, and it's like, that's it. Like, there's a different genius there, obviously, but like, let me tell you, there is nothing profound coming out of that dude's mouth in any conversation whatsoever. It's just remarkable. Versus, for example, it was like totally blown away. You get the same thing out of like a lot of athletes when they do interviews about the sports that they play, the games, and it's like, I don't know, man, just give me the ball. Versus, if you've ever listened to LeBron James give an interview about the games that he has played, it is extraordinary, right? I mean, I listened to an interview where someone asked a question about I can't remember, it was like the 9 or the 10 turnovers that the team had during a specific game. And James begins being like, well, I don't know, it's like, it's hard to give you a sense of like what was the reason behind each one, and then proceeds to go through a concrete description of exactly what happened for each one of those turnovers and why it happened, who was involved, where it was on the court, where the mistake got made, whose attention was flagging, what the other team was doing. And you're just thinking to yourself that, oh my God, right? Like that is a beyond photographic recall of what, not just like what happened over the course of that, hour-long game, but like also an in time or real-time understanding of where the mistakes were made, and being able then to talk to a pool of reporters and retell that off the cuff. You're dealing just with a advanced intelligence, right? And that is why it's like one of the greatest basketball players of all time. And so obviously that happens in various different places with musicians. It happens with certain visual artists. It happens all the time with these various different things, but it's a rare feat. And again, you can't hold everybody to that same standard, but you certainly know what's at the very opposite end of that spectrum is Tom Petty, right? It's just like which doesn't mean you can't be any less successful. It's not a judgment, right? Love Tom Petty's music, but it's like, that's not the person you're going to have an interview about the music industry with.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that was great about Jules' sort of career early on was, like she said, that, at the time, people, other musicians or the industry, it's kind of like the MFA programs, not really teaching anything about business, to fine artists, and just sort of saying like, hey, make great work, and and all these things, and I guess they just think that hopefully it'll work out for you, but they're not teaching you about contracts with galleries, just like these different types of business matters. And it's Jewel was saying it's very similar. Most musicians probably just don't probably have a mental block to learning those things or wanting to know more about them, or just figure like, hey, I just want to play music until I'm famous enough that somebody will handle that for me. And I think a lot of fine artists feel the same way. But going back to the idea that she's much more intellectual about her approach, she went and read books about the music industry, figured out licensing deals, and made sure that the deal that she took on her first album was something that benefited her strategically, right? She could have had a much larger advance, didn't want to be beholden to anybody, and and it's that commitment to educating herself about all things related to what she's doing that have that have allowed her to excel.
Yeah, no, it's definitely there's a real sense of curiosity that comes through, right? That like, if I don't know about this thing, I'm not just going to take it on someone else's advice about how to operate. I'm going to figure it out and take the time and energy that it does, not just because out of paranoia, I don't want to get screwed, more out of, I need to know how this works in order to make sure that I'm going to do the best thing I can and get the most out of it.
Yeah. And a sense of humility of like, I'm not going to assume that everybody wants me in any given room,
Right.
Which I just thought was like actually kind of refreshing for like a mega star to be like, yeah, the country music people didn't want me, and I understand why they thought that in the beginning.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
And I forget that, like, I mean, she was everywhere for a number of years. You know what I mean? I mean that, like, and you just don't, I think today it's the same type of thing. It's like to break through to the kind of level of just being part of the public consciousness, so that, such that like more people know your name than don't, is like a really difficult achievement, especially within the art and cultural sphere, right? Like, and it's funny because music is a little bit more of a popular art form just by definition, not just pop music, but itself, given the way that it's disseminated and how people engage with it and the amount of time that it demands of your attention. such that, the only artists that I think probably more people have heard of than not would probably be Picasso and Warhol, right? And then after that, it's a pretty steep drop off in terms of like who's heard of what. And we know that there's some wildly successful visual artists out there, but just like, how, I mean, I could take a poll within my extended family about how many people know who William Kentridge is, right? And it's just like, like, nope, never heard of it. It's like no clue, whatever, right? And versus, Jewel, like everybody is like, remember Jewel? And you're like, yeah, totally, right? And someone starts, humming some bars of a song. It's like that is, penetration, right? That's like gotten through to people at a certain level, and even to the point that like that has echoes down the line, because now it's like I tell my 12-year-old daughter, oh, I'm interviewing Jewel. She's like, who's that? And I'm like, oh, well, like listen to this song while we're going to school in the morning. 5 minutes later, she's like, oh, cool. All right. Yeah. Now I know who that is. And like, she's listening to all, I mean, this is the other great thing about the streaming platforms, is a little bit of a digression, but it's like, there is no history to to like the next generation's music consumption, right? Like my daughter's listening to Jewel, Johnny Cash, the soundtrack to Hamilton, and like Olivia Rodrigo, and it's all temporally like it's distributed in the same space and time. It's all her present. And she's like humming, don't bring your guns to town. And I'm like, that's hilarious. Like I played that once, fully assuming she's going to be like, what is this? That is not something that I ever want to hear again. Next thing you know, she's humming Don't Bring Your Guns to Town and is like, let's play that. And it's my wife who's like, no, we're not listening to this like morose, bad country music in the car. And my daughter's like, come on.
My 8-year-old nephew went through a phase where he absolutely loved The Devil Went Down to Georgia by Charlie Daniels Band, until he got scolded at school for saying the word bitch when he was reciting the lyrics. And then he didn't want to hear it anymore because it made him upset to think about getting yelled at school. But this actually goes to something Yotam said, which is an interesting dynamic. And I actually agree with him in some aspects on this, but we don't buy albums anymore. I haven't bought an album. I buy records. I buy, I collect some vinyl, but I don't buy CDs anymore. And frankly, records are so, logically impractical or logistically impractical that it's not the same. But, so back when you bought albums, you thought carefully about which albums you were going to buy. Like I didn't buy albums where I only liked one song. Like that was just like not going to happen. So, like every album I ever owned was always a band that there was a lot about them that I liked. But you had to like kind of learn those things before you research them. You had to try to listen to the radio and catch that song and different things until you felt a level of comfort to go buy the album. And then when you bought it, you kind of cherished it, and you'd be listening to it for the first time and reading the album artwork and reading who played on which tracks and, the thank you credits and all of this stuff. And I think there was something really nice to that. And I agree with you, Tom, that like now that music is just a smorgasbord of whatever you want to hear, it feels a little devalued. But on the upside, your daughter probably wasn't going to buy a Johnny Cash album. Now I think there's so much less of a barrier to hear things that you wouldn't have heard otherwise, right? There's no barrier to entry for going to Spotify and checking out some track that your aunt recommended, that you might like because you like this other classic rock band or whatever else. And so, you don't have to be so discerning about exploring new music because it's so easy to access, which means that, newer generations can have like really eclectic, wide ranging taste and get to know tracks here and there and artists here and there without like the hurdle of needing to buy an album, which is nice. But it also probably does have this other effect of not of us not valuing an album or things like that, or even just when artists take care to make an album that is a work of art when you listen to it from beginning to end. I think those days are also a little diminished because everything's so track oriented.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, artists still work with the concept of the album in place. Many of them do,
for sure. The best ones, for sure.
Yeah, but I hear what you're saying in terms of like the way that they get consumed, right? Is so, through the platforms and everything else is so much more difficult and distributed, to figure out how that stuff gets, I can certainly like the listening habits that my daughter exhibits, or even I exhibit, given I listen to so little music these days any longer, is just like a lot less of a kind of episodic series listening, unless it's tied to some other storyline. So, there's a lot of sort of bouncing around in between songs and things rather than, listening to a whole album all the way through, right? As if that sort of like told a story or has a sort of take or like a sound or a kind of sensibility that then changes with the next album that an artist puts out there. Again, there's no temporality for these kids. Like they got no sense of history. It's just like all this perpetual present for them. And like, unless it's their own lives, it's their own lives that gives them the you know the temporality. I was listening to that in fifth grade.
Right. Although admittedly for me, listening to an album all the way through was like often a function of like laziness, like not wanting to get up and skip it. So I don't know how much it was like necessarily an investment.
Because you had to like put the tape in the tape deck and then like,
Right.
that's it. Like
it's in.
What comes in order comes in order. That's all you have.
Right. You listen to the whole album because otherwise you had to rewind.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. No,
I'm going to go on a loosely connected tangent here, but I don't know if either of you are aware of this, but if you sync up Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album and start it on the third roar of the MGM Lion at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, it is the most synced up experience you could possibly imagine. The Munchkins are dancing to the exact timing of Money. The transition from the black and white part of the movie to the color one is when Money kicks in, and Pink Floyd has like said that they didn't do this on purpose. That it's just a coincidence and what have you. But I think that there's a few reasons why I just don't believe that at all. First, because how would anyone have known that it takes doing it on the third roar of the MGM Lion to make it happen if they hadn't been tipped off to the fact that was where you needed to start? Because if you start it anywhere else, it doesn't work. So it has to, you have to hit play. It's got to be a CD or a record. It can't be a tape where you got to switch it, like all these things. So, but the other thing, and the reason why I brought this up, because you were talking about like the crafting of albums and like moving on to the next one and these artists who sort of like evolve over time. It makes complete sense to me that a group who ended up making The Wall, which was a long form album put to a film that had popular songs, absolute hits on it, but these like long interludes between to connect the songs so that they would be timed up with the appropriate parts of the movie. It would make sense to me that they would practice doing that one time before they made The Wall, that they would take an iconic movie, they would make a bunch of songs, maybe they wrote Money on its own, maybe they wrote Time on its own, and, but then they put these interludes in there so that it would queue up with these key moments in the movie and they, and everything else. Like it just, to me, not only does it seem ridiculous and coincidental that anybody would have discovered that it works that way. And if you watch it, it's impossible that it's just like, it's too well done to be totally coincidental. But again, I think like the other big argument for it is just that they went on to create this film soundtrack pop album, and it just makes sense to me that that you would think, hey, let's see if we can do that with this other album, and try it before we have this vision to do this other one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, Pink Floyd is the kind of signal example of that moment of the album as a story arc, right? Like of a narrative telling a full story there. Different than just kind of a collections of songs that put together a kind of atmospherics or a sensibility, right? Or that kind of tell a story, but not quite so in narrative structure. Joey, as you're saying that, I was like, these are the kinds of conspiracy theories we really like have lost hold of. This is the kind of stuff that like used to consume, us in the 1980s and totally benign about culture and you know, but, but we've sort of lost sight of that. Now it's all gotten much darker.
No, it's way too
and,
high stakes now.
and more nefarious.
Low stakes conspiracy theories. This is a great
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the kind of
gone from
conspiracies that
why-
like, yeah, more conducive to like the college dorm room with a joint than you know, an AR-15 in the backwoods of fucking Washington State, right? Like,
or you know, you're like, you know, it used to be the conspiracy theories, like why did did Pink Floyd make this album to go with the Wizard of Oz? Like, you know, was it on purpose or whatever? And now the conspiracy is like, why does Diddy have 1,000 bottles of baby oil?
so gross.
What else? Anything else, guys?
No, I was only going to you know, bring up the headlines, but by all indications, it's very possible that Sotheby's, the auction house, may either go bankrupt or have to get sold again to another, you know, private entity. You know, it's gotten shored up by the it looks like one of the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, and so there's some extra capital there. But you know, for a lot of the recent reporting, it looks like Drahi, the fellow who bought the auction house and brought it private, I think in 2019, has basically squeezed it of all of its capital, and now it is saddled by a ton of debt. And given the market downturn, it's could go someplace. Not good. That is an interesting development. That's one of the big three quote unquote auction houses, one of the big players, one of the big brand names, the first registered I think it was like one of the first registered stocks in the New York Stock Exchange was Sotheby's.
Oh.
And
when was Sotheby's founded?
In the 18th century. I mean, founded as a entity
18th
in the 18th
century?
18th century. Yeah, I think 1755.
Man,
yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But as a publicly traded company, I think it's a different story.
But how bad do you feel if you're the one who drove a 300-year-old company into the ground?
Yeah.
That's not something you want to put on your resume.
Yeah. So, you know, interesting days in the art world, as they say.
Yeah. What else, Rocket? Are you hearing any interesting news from around the art world?
Well, I'm hearing a lot of like, so are you selling anything?
Oh.
So I don't know if that's interesting or not, but it seems prevalent.
Yeah, it feels pretty universal. What do you think, Jonathan? Do you know of anybody who's doing well despite the market?
Great.
So I will say that I had a conversation with an artist recently, but I'm not going to name names just for fear of like, you know, one, making 90% of the people feel bad, and then the 10% of the people like, or this one person pissed at me. But I did have a conversation with an artist who said that they you know, thankfully, but you know, very graciously, hands together, thank you, like they have sold like a handful of pieces just in the last few months, even during the downturn, and some substantial stuff. Couple things out of one recent show, and then something that just sort of like appeared out of nowhere by one of this artist's sort of long-running galleries. So they're happy, but knows full well that that's not the story that a lot of people have been telling themselves. And listen, like you know, this is also not the case where there's some like fundamentals that have gone out of the system. Like, I think that this is probably a correction on the part of, you know, what is, you know, understandably the very small high-end market for contemporary art in particular. A lot of these people are also involved with various different nonprofit philanthropic institutions like museums and art centers. I'm sure they are probably still handing over their capital to those places, keeping people in their jobs, keeping, you know, the rest of the kind of infrastructure afloat. If it's just that people have sort of stepped back from the conspicuous competitive consumption that marked probably, you know, a few years of activities there, especially post-pandemic, then, you know, it may not rise to the heights that it once was, but you know, people will always find reason and a desire to put money back into this field. It's not, it hasn't cratered because of some more significant economic fallout. That I would be more concerned if, inflation was back up at 10 or 12% and interest rates had to go back up to even higher than the 5% or 5.5% or 5.25% where they were. As it is, rates dropped 50 basis points. As it is, the election is going to be decided in, what is it, 50 days or something very short. As it is, the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine continue apace. So, we'll see what happens.
That was going to be my next question is, do you think that the art world will see a partial rebound after the election?
Short answer, yes. Right? Like, I mean, I think there'll be some fallout, but I think that by the time you get to like February of next year, it'll be a little bit of a different scene, right? Like stability will have ensued. Look, like Congress just managed to get together and pass its 3-month continuing resolution, so you're not facing a showdown over government. It's like all this stuff just has to sort of hit back into the sort of the regular course of business. Again, I remind you, like the stock market, which is, as much as people want to kind of claim that it's not, is relatively pretty well correlated with the art market, has been doing very well, right? So whether the, people, if the stock market takes a tumble in the next month and a half or something like that, there'll be tons of articles that are like, oh, look, the art world is a trailing, is a early indicator of, stock movements. And then all of a sudden you'll have a bunch of people who have no idea what they're talking about, making these claims about the correlation of those markets. Over time, it just common sense when you think about it, the people whose wealth is majority tied up with things like equities, those are also the people who have the largest roles to play within the art market. So stock market's doing well, those people are feeling flush. If interest rates are coming down, capital is less expensive, there's going to be activity in those marketplaces.
I don't even know if this is a conversation we want to have, but do you think that the extent of a potential rebound for the art market after the election will be different depending on who wins?
No. You mean, does the art market look different under Trump than it does under Harris?
Well, rich people make more money, I think, when Republicans are in charge, and middle class and whatever do, I think, a little better when the Democrats are in charge. But then again, arts funding also gets slashed under,
Yeah, well, remember the arts
regimes.
funding that the government's responsible for is like minuscule, so it has no real effect on the broader spectrum stuff. Yeah, I mean, I don't like Kamala is not, in my book, a communist enough, as much as Trump wants to claim that she is, to foreshadow any significant challenges in the rarefied landscapes of what happens at art fairs and auction houses and in the galleries. Yeah, so I think it's very hard to A/B test that hypothesis, right? Because we can't.
Yeah, for sure.
And I also think that the president has very little. In fact, president and presidential policies have very little real effects on the economy in such immediate terms. It's only over the longer term that you've got it.
Do you think, I'm curious if you think, or if you've heard, not opinion, but, have you seen anything policy wise, like, for example, royalties that are required in Europe on secondary sales and things like that? Do you think that either, do you see any changes at the policy level over the next 4 years that would be important for artists?
Probably the biggest. So I've said this before, the most important arts policy that you could possibly have would be housing and health policy, right? Because those are the things that directly affect the way that most artists function. So if, it's total bullshit, but Trump claiming that he's going to put together a deregulatory commission with Elon Musk at the head of it that's going to cut through all this government regulation, and that somehow that trickle down deregulation will get to the point where you can have more housing and more inexpensive housing. that would be good for artists. That's not the way housing works in this country, and there's very little that the federal government can do to handle that. And it's a big problem. Health insurance is a different story. Again, the best thing that a policymaker could do would be to have very good, very inexpensive, broad-based healthcare coverage for all people, that isn't attached to your place of employment, because that is something that would, greatly, vastly improve the lives of artists who often work independently outside of large organizations, et cetera. And so that would give them thing. Again, Trump tried to abolish the Obamacare, says they have concepts of a plan for a healthcare policy. He's had 9 years to put together. That's all BS. Harris's team believes that they've already fixed that problem. So I don't think you'll see any more coming from that side. So, the big two that could actually affect artists most directly, are probably just not going to be dealt with at all in the coming 4 years. So that's a disappointment. For sort of like anything that's like more direct, I would actually think that Web3 crypto regulation and activity may be the place that you would have the most direct issues for facing artists, not because I think that the NFT market is coming back, but because our whole conversation about royalties, our whole conversation about, regulation within the markets and being able to track secondary and tertiary sales, Web3 based registries and that whole world seems to have the most promise for something that could be adopted as an industry standard within these precincts. But again, the verve for AI has totally derailed all of the money and the research and the stuff that was going into Web3 and to blockchain at that point. And so I don't know what that looks like. But that is sort of what I would expect to be like a place where you'd have some like policy meddling that, would have immediate downstream effects for artists, especially, from the SEC standpoint. Remember, we talked to various different artists who were involved in these, offerings and fractionalized offerings of artworks and other things like that the SEC could swoop in and be like, nope, that's a security. You guys are, not doing the right stuff. So if that was a lot more lenient, maybe it would be under a Trump administration than a Harris administration. Who knows? Maybe there'd be a lot more opportunity for experimentation there, but I don't know.
Just the final thing on that is AI policy could theoretically impact artists quite a bit, right? I mean,
yeah,
I don't know that they're going to prohibit people laying off workers or just
yeah,
not being allowed to use AI tools like that. But there could be some AI regulation that slows down the takeover of creative jobs and things like that by artificial intelligence, or at least figures out a way in which artists get compensated perhaps for their work being trained on those models, or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to Rocket, what you were talking about earlier. I actually think that's probably the most promising place to see artists and creative workers organized and advocating for being compensated by these artificial intelligence companies for their work showing up in the training data, right? And I don't know what that compensation looks like, and I don't know what the real benefit redounds to the artists are, because again, you're talking about a bunch of individuals who are then skimming some percentage away from the billions of dollars that are being invested in these big AI companies. And so, yes, it could benefit them, but it's who's really going to benefit from that in the long term? At least they'll, be able to titularly say, yes, we are being compensated. We are getting some sort of royalty or some sort of compensation from these companies by being part of their trading data sets. And I think that's beginning to happen, right? There are, the New York Times and these other newspapers and places are striking deals to allow access to archives of their stuff in order to have bigger models built. And so someone's getting paid for that, right? Don't know if it's a journalist, it's probably not, but it's somebody.
We'll do a callback. They're probably charging them a data transfer fee for all that, and
exactly.
not a royalty, so that they don't have to share it with anybody.
Exactly.
That took a turn, but that was fun. For everybody listening, we've got 2 episodes. Say again?
I like Jonathan's predictions.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think we were going to do more of this. So for those listening, our next two episodes are super interesting. We have a street artist named Finch who has become incredibly well known around San Francisco and increasingly St. Louis, where he's from. For a lot of, for sort of dominating the mural space in San Francisco. He raises quite a lot of money for charity using his art, and in a very different way than a lot of other artists who might just donate a piece. He's got a style that lends itself well to contextualizing the work for the charity, which is really interesting. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Jonathan and I just recorded an episode, was it yesterday or the day before, Jonathan, with Justin Jacobs, the author of a new book called Plunder. What's the tagline, Jonathan? Plunder?
Oh my God. How museums got their treasures.
Right.
Plunder? How museums got their treasures.
And it is super interesting. I mean, everybody we talk to is incredibly smart about the things that they do, but a lot of them are also just like trying things that have never been done before and learning along the way. And I think it was just really interesting to talk to an absolute domain expert about the history of the acquisition of these antiquities, and super interesting chat about how museums came to own these things. Definitely counter to, at least in some ways, to the narrative that's pretty common. So if you're interested in understanding more about that, that'll be in 2 more weeks. Jonathan, Rocket, thanks for another great roundtable, and we'll talk again in a few weeks.
Bye.
Thanks both.
Bye.